Welcome to episode 2 of the Brothers of Liberty. This is just going to be a quick solo episode. Just going to do, talk about the Supreme Court for a little bit, if you like. Listen, hopefully, and enjoy. So I'd like to start this off with, first and foremost, rest in peace to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's a human being. She passed away, and we all mourn loss in general. Complicated Supreme Court justice. If you're conservative, you don't like her. If you're a liberal, you love her. And I'm just gonna be honest with you, I don't like her, and I'm not a really conservative person. It's just the way she legislated was a bit of an authoritarian legislation, and she had some racial issues as well. She's kind of an elitist person. When she was nominated, she was supposed to be this moderate lefty, I guess you could say, a little bit like Clinton at the very least, the perception of what they were trying to do. And then she comes in and really just, changed the court the radical way, et cetera, and they're propping her up, being this feminist icon when, she's the second female Supreme Court justice, the first one being Sandra Day O'Connor, which people forget sometimes, Oh, but we're going to prop her up as a liberal one. And it's like, okay, well, the conservative guy literally just nominated her, Sandra Day O'Connor, like 10 years prior, so what are you doing? And she had a lot of issues. Personally, I think she was a bit of a power-grabbing kind of person. And the whole reason why this current fiasco that we're dealing with right now is because she refused to leave the court, even though she's had numerous health issues. At least, like I think Sandra Day O'Connor is still alive, but, she left well before then. A lot of people did, That was a big problem with Scalia. He died on the bench, unfortunately. But I guess it's complicated, I don't think she's a good person, but we should always respect the dead and never speak truly ill of them unless you're Hitler. So, in order to really, before we get to the deep dive, I think I just want to do a bit of a brief overview of just the history of the Supreme Court. It's a little bit fascinating, and I'm bound to get some details wrong. So I hope you guys really just look it up yourselves. But this is just me uncovering, doing my deep dives in history, especially with George Washington and the framing and the creation of the Constitution. It's deeply fascinating because, and it's argued that, the Supreme Court doesn't really originate with the Constitution itself, I could argue. It specifically, because it starts with the actual Judiciary Act that Washington signs about a year later, of 1790, that effectively creates the Supreme Court. But they always had envisioned this highest law of the land, in terms of what the Supreme Court actually is, and basically to be the highest law of the land between the differences, and arguments between the states and the federal government, to basically just be the final say. They're supposed to be this objective, like they framed it and created it in this particular way, so that they have the seats for life, so that there's gonna be no bias whatsoever or political backstabbing, that because they understood human nature very well, and human capabilities and what was going to happen because of that. So thank God to them. It's complicated, though. I will say, the Supreme Court really didn't do much initially when it was first enacted and created. It was because you have to understand many things. Like, for instance, there's no specified number of people that can be on the Supreme Court. There could be 50, and Trump can just be a mad lad and just fucking put on 10 people. Just go 19. Let's just fucking go for it, or 8. Just go for it. And technically speaking, he can do it. But the Senate's not gonna. The Senate's not that crazy. They're not gonna do anything like that. But for the most part, there's no specified number. In fact, when it first started, there was about 6 people, five associate justices, and the Chief Justice, who was John Jay, who, if you don't know who John Jay is, he's one of the 3 people who helped write the Federalist Papers. He wrote the fewest, but he was also, I would argue, relatively speaking, a pretty solid intellectual heavyweight. And for about 10 years, John Jay and his Jay Court really didn't do much. They legislated about a handful of cases, and it really wasn't until John Marshall, who was nominated by John Adams, that when he served as the Chief Justice for basically the next 30 years or so, that things really changed. Because when the Supreme Court was first enacted, it was the final law of the land in some ways, but they didn't really have a lot of power, and a lot of people actually didn't really want to be a part of the Supreme Court at that point in time. They'd rather have more power and be president, or you had more power in the House of Representatives than in the Supreme Court. So I think it's interesting. And then when the actual it wasn't until John Marshall came along, and specifically the case known as Marbury versus Madison, which is one that really changed the actual powers of the Supreme Court, because that actually gave them power of judicial review, which means that they literally are the final law, and actually set the precedent that, hey, the Supreme Court can actually rule on basically everything and anything, which is why that case is a landmark case, because the Supreme Court from that point on has power, real power. And then people at that point just like trying to put up how many justices and whatnot and associate justices, and John Marshall just became a thorn in Thomas Jefferson and Madison's side for the most part for a couple years. And history is interesting with them. So and numbers fluctuated over time, sometimes 7, 9. It really just depended on the politics at that particular time. But even people in the 1860s and 70s and the early 19, they weren't crazy. They weren't like, okay, we can't keep putting people on the Supreme Court. We can't have 15 members. We're not wild. We're not trying to be crazy like that. So effectively, they all kind of like in a gentleman's agreement decided 9's kind of like the optimum number. That's the absolute most that we're going to be able to get to, which is why when FDR tried to court pack, in the 1930s, he was trying to get a lot of his New Deal policies done. Everyone lost their fucking minds, rightfully so. And don't get me wrong, technically speaking, the one thing FDR really did that was technically legal was court packing, and I think that's kind of funny and ironic. But for the most part, it's been 9 justices for about 100 plus years since they basically had their agreements for the most part. And it'll fluctuate. Sometimes it's 8, and they'll have that seat open until the next president comes in, etc., etc., etc. So what would you say is the history of the last 20 years? And I think that history is really interesting. I really go back to Reagan, because Reagan's presidency, I believe he had 4 people on the actual Supreme Court he had nominated and appointed. 2 of them are most notably Scalia, Sandra Day O'Connor, and the one that I always found interesting was he attempted at one point to nominate this justice, Robert Bork. And I think this is where it starts, specifically. And I think it's his case that I think is fascinating. And Robert Bork was I forgot, like a 7th Circuit appointee. He was actually, he was about 60 at that point. But I would argue, looking at just a couple of his cases, I don't want to say an intellectual heavyweight. That's probably not the right way to say it. But, I would say he's like an originalist kind of constitutional individual. And I'll explain that in just a little bit. But basically someone who looks at the Constitution the way that the founders really had, founded it basically. And I was like really strictly about how the founders interpreted it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And he had a lot of problems, because he was against like the Civil Rights Act, et cetera, and saw things. He was, and in fairness and defense of him, I would probably say he's someone that thinks that you should probably do it through culture, not through federal government legislation, kind of thing. So, despite being someone who's prominent and has the capabilities, et cetera, to be an actual Supreme Court justice, they were basically blasting him in every sense of the word and doing everything they can to the Democrats specifically to stop that specific nomination from going through. I think it was Ted Kennedy, the youngest Kennedy brother who was a part of the actual government for the most part, Robert and John F. Kennedy being his older brothers. I don't like Ted Kennedy. I'm just going to be honest. I think he has a lot of issues. But he effectively ruined his Supreme Court nomination. This guy's going to take your right from abortion, et cetera, yeah. Anyways, I guess what I'm trying to say, Bork's nomination was specifically, I don't want to say controversial, but I would probably say that if you think, the political attacks, the personal attacks that have been occurring with some of the Supreme Court justices in the last 30 years have been, like sporadic. It starts with Bork, is what I'm trying to say. Like the real aggressive political fighting that is happening really starts with Bork. And Bork, he doesn't get through. I think he loses 42 to 58 in the Senate during his confirmation. Like they could not vote for him. And then I believe after that he nominates Anthony Kennedy, one of the Kennedy people, to replace Bork a couple months later. And then you go through the decades and the years since then, and there's been a lot of politically motivated or personally motivated attacks on some Supreme Court justices. And I was listening to Robert Barnes, and he makes a real good point that, most of the time, and if you don't change the actual status quo, like 5-4, 4-5, like egregiously, if it's at least like in the middle for the most part, where there's no overwhelming majority of one political leaning or one political side, where it's 2-1 essentially, then nothing really happens. Or that in midterm elections and election years, obviously. Most notably was like George H.W. Bush trying to nominate, who was that Supreme Court justice? I don't have it in front of me. But, it's the thing that people have been pointing out, the Biden rule and whatnot. Little things like that have really occurred. And, of course, the nomination of Clarence Thomas is a indeed a hit. That's a tough one. But, for the most part, other than that, most of the justices that have been nominated and confirmed have been relatively peaceful, because they mainly replace, either like a liberal replaces a liberal or a conservative replaces a conservative, and that's just how it's really been for the last, 20 years. And other than some contested ones, where there's Eric Garland or Kavanaugh, it's been, for the most part, relatively peaceful. But the ones that have occurred are specifically ones that have occurred in like election years, or ones that would change the status quo, and Kavanaugh, I think, was during an actual midterm election around that particular point in time. So Trump, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying and passing away, now has the opportunity before to nominate a third Supreme Court justice, which I don't know who has the most, to be honest. I would probably say FDR, because he was in office for damn near 14 years at that point in time. I think Reagan had 4, so I think that's a lot for 8 years. And he's probably gonna have the opportunity to do more, I would probably say. I think the 3 liberal ones right now, they're firmly gonna be in place. They're relatively young, and they're gonna be there for a while. Clarence Thomas will probably retire soon, and Alito's not a spring chicken either. And it's gonna be interesting, is what I'm gonna be saying. So first and foremost, can Trump do this? Yes, he can. First off, let's just be honest. He can nominate anyone well before this, or well before his term. It just depends if the Senate wishes to actually, go through with the nomination and the hearing, et cetera, et cetera. And the truth is that as long as the Senate's willing, they can, and they're gonna vote, and they'll confirm and just basically do that. And the Senate doesn't have to do that, especially during an election year. But it's basically within their right. And everyone is going to be complaining left and right because, the same thing, kind of happened with Obama. They're trying to get Garland, I believe. I'm probably getting that person mixed up. But Obama tried to nominate his person. McConnell wouldn't do it because, well, they don't have to, And the truth is it's the whole point, It's if people wanted a liberal Supreme Court, then they probably should have voted, for a Democrat in the Senate, but they didn't. So it's just how the game works, unfortunately. So that's why it's important to vote where shit like this, occurs. And, it's been like this for a while, specifically with, Biden rule, et cetera, et cetera. And then someone is basically like, well, they can, protest and stuff and, do the whole filibuster for the judges. And, well, technically speaking, they can't do that either. Again, during the Obama administration, specifically the Harry Reid legislation, that the Senate scrapped that rule for the filibuster for the judges when, they're trying to get the Republicans to stop filibustering a lot of their Supreme Court nominations and picks. And, and I don't like Mitch McConnell. I think he's kind of a shitty person, if I'm gonna be honest with you. But I agree with him when he says, hey guys, if you're gonna fucking do this shit, don't be mad when we do the exact same shit to you guys. So it is what it is. So let's talk about the potential nominee. Well, as of the recording, he's already chosen Amy Coney Barrett. I'll get to her in just a second. But before, I would say there's realistically, I would probably say at least 5 candidates. It depends on, whether you believe he was going to just pick a girl. But, I think Trump was just keeping his options open, but he was always probably going to be a girl. The two male candidates I thought that had a real opportunity would be Ted Cruz. I think Ted Cruz had a real shot, in my personal view, but he wasn't going to take it. Maybe Josh Hawley, I think, but he also wasn't going to take it too. They're both representatives. A lot of people have said Tom Cotton. I think that's just funny. He's like, we got to overturn Roe v. Wade, and I'm just like, personally, I don't care, because I just think that'd be funny, because Trump would, if he did that, Trump would basically just be throwing a fucking wrench in an airplane turbine, and I'm just like, dude, you're just a fucking mad lad, just going for it. But the true, I guess you could say, there was technically, I would say, 3 actual female nominees that were going to get even remotely some level of serious consideration. The first one was the one that he ultimately picked, was Amy Coney Barrett. She was on the 7th Circuit. And then after that was Barbara Lagoa, who was on the 11th Circuit. Well, I thought she was going to be the actual front runner, just knowing Trump. And then the last one, which I tend to agree with, and a lot of people and trusted lawyers and other individuals who tend to agree with, is Allison Jones Rushing, who's on the 4th Circuit. She's also the youngest by far, and she'd be the youngest Supreme Court justice of all time if she got on the actual bench. So, how do I feel? I go back and forth. I've done as much of a deep dive as I humanly can, looking at actual court documents and and don't be fair, I'm not a lawyer or law student, and actually just listen to a whole bunch of lawyers who have their own personal perceptions and opinions, and you can say I'm convinced by them, but after listening to them and looking at it and understanding the specifics of their actual courts and court court judicial fucking paperwork, I guess you could say, I tend to have now, I think, a relatively solid opinion on the 3 potential nominees. My favorite being Allison Jones Rushing. She's something else. She's a bit of a mad lad. A lot of people don't like her because of her, ties to the, like a Christian organization, et cetera, who's against LGBTQ. And it's like, once you actually go do it, like, just even do a cursory Google search, it's kind of like, well, she's kind of a part of an organization that kind of supported somebody that was, against LGBTQ kind of people. So it's just like, you're making leaps and bounds of something that's technically speaking kind of true, but not actually a true thing. And it's not like she's, oh my god, banging the drum for it. I don't even know what she is politically. I just think she's someone that's so apprehensive to the government and willing to challenge people that she's just like an OG kind of person. And I've read some of her decisions, and my baseline for like a great decision is the Stickman ruling for the lockdowns in Pennsylvania. That one's basically like 60 to 70 pages of just pure, this is how this happened, this is how you violated the first, like 14th, 13th, like a shit ton of amendments, and in like a fair court decision where he's not actively doing anything or writing anything specifically that the Pennsylvania is going to basically appeal for the most part, and or capable of appealing successfully, which I don't think they did as of this recording. And Allison Jones Rushing, I think, would be in the similar vein. She's a smart person. She's incredibly, excuse me, she's 38. She's young. She's a spry chicken. I don't know if she's a Trump Republican, but at the very least, in terms of the tendencies of presidents to pick nominees that tend to reflect their character in a lot of aspects, in a lot of ways. I think Jones Rushing would probably be the closest one. She's a big constitutional believer, and and this goes into the idea and discussion of what there's, because people have been basically saying that oh, she's a constitutional originalist or a constitutional interpreter. A constitutional originalist specifically is someone that believes and will legislate the way that the founders had fundamentally and functionally interpreted. So you're basically just legislating in the way that James Madison would legislate, and how the actual original Constitution fundamentally is. And then you have the abstract or interpretive people, usually liberals, who tend to basically be along the lines of, well, we can do it with modern times and modern intervention, and modern interpretations, I guess you could say, with the changing cultures, which again I'm not against, but it's got to be done in in the actual right way about it, and not one that violates the specific specific Bill of Rights and specific need and like once you start legislating against gun rights for the most part, it's unconstitutional in my perspective. That's just a fact in my view. So Jones Rushing is they're all in some ways, in shape and form, all originalists. Jones Rushing, Lagoa, and Barrett's. But in fairness, Rushing's probably the closest to the actual. And they don't describe her as an originalist, but a lot of the things that she her decisions are more based on originalism than anything else, and I think that's deeply fascinating. She'd be my favorite. She'd be my pick but Trump was never going to nominate her. She was always going to be third because for two reasons. One, she was never going to get through. Like if this was not an actual election year, and he wasn't trying to get someone into the actual Supreme Court itself, I think she would probably actually be the nominee. But if you got 50 days, they're not going to. Democrats are going to be. I don't even think Republicans would vote for her, not just because of who she is or being another Trump kind of appointee Supreme Court judge, but it's also just the reality that she's 38 years old, and people need to conceptualize and understand that a lot of the judges, when they get nominated to the Supreme Court, they're much older for the most part. So hypothetically, Rushing could be on the Supreme Court for 50 years if she had obviously took care of herself, but she could legislate for 50 plus years or so on the Supreme Court, and Democrats and I think some Republicans would not like that. They don't want another Trump for 50 years, at least on the Supreme Court. And she's probably the closest thing to, a Trump judge, is what I would probably say. Next is Barbara Lagoa, Cuban immigrants, etc., Florida. She's been on the state court for dozens of years. I thought Trump would pick her, and not. Here's my perspective. It was always going to be between Barrett and Lagoa. Those were just the two that were the most obvious logical choices. I think both will get through. Don't get me wrong. I think Lagoa would have been the much smarter choice. Like, I look at it in the sense that, how do I explain it? Lagoa is like the smart play for political purposes for the most part. Can you imagine if Trump just chose her, a female immigrant family, in Florida, to like it's just like, okay, I got Florida, I got the immigrant angle, I got the female angle, and for the most part she's a pretty solid judge. She seemed like the smart play in every sense of the word, and I thought Trump was going to basically be doing that. And I wasn't going to be shocked if he chose Barrett, because everyone was just shoving Barrett down his throat, and I just thought Trump wasn't enough of an independent-minded individual in the White House to make that decision to go for Lagoa. Although, in fairness, Trump, I don't think, it's business is one thing, and I think even just being a leader and a manager and all that's another thing. But when it comes to judges and judicial appointments, he's just gonna go to the Federalist Society. Federalist Society, by the way, it's a complicated society. I'm not really the biggest fan of them. But for the most part, they've been, I guess you could say the leading conservative voice on conservative judges and conservative appointees. Like most of the recent Republican nominated judges have really come from there. Roberts, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, I think, were all a part of the Federalist Society. And it depends on how you look at it. I don't really like it because it gave you John Roberts. So, and I think Barrett's a little bit complicated. I'll get into that in just a second. And, it's not like they're a bad society. I mean, if it gave you Gorsuch too, so, I actually have a much higher respect for Gorsuch in relative, to be honest with you. I would say he's probably the closest thing to an actual Trump Supreme Court judge there is. A lot of people don't like that, but it is what it is. I thought Lagoa was going to be the smart play. She's not like a Trump judge, but she is someone who, at the very least, first off, I think if it came down to an election between Trump and Biden, she's going to vote Trump. And above all else, I think she's someone that at least based off of some of her court decisions, other than, she is pro-business. So let's get that very clear. But unless it's going to, but she won't do it unless it's going to I'll put it this way, she will support businesses, at least judicially speaking. But at the same time, if it egregiously violates your rights for the most part constitutionally, then she's going to go against it. She was on the right side of the lockdown, I guess is what I'm trying to say, in terms of, hey, this is not right or unconstitutional, So I guess I had a much more positive opinion, and out of the two who were going to get in, I probably would have picked Lagoa. It's just in terms of she checks all the boxes, but Trump obviously didn't go that way. And then you come to Amy Coney Barrett, Trump's third judicial nominee for the Supreme Court. She was part of the Seventh Circuit of Appeals. I don't know how I feel about her in a lot of ways. She's a very complicated Supreme Court nominee and a very complicated Supreme Court justice in many aspects. A lot of people have been shoving her down. Cause, look, I'll put it to you this way. You do a cursory Google search of her, and most of the stories that come up initially are like, is Amy Coney Barrett going to do this? Oh, is Amy Coney Barrett going to do this? And there's actually enough stories to defend that are actually defending her that I start to question, this is interesting, And then I type in Rushing and like Lagoa, and the first 10 that pop up are like, oh, why is Lagoa the wrong choice and Rushing's anti-LGBTQ, like aggressively negative? Don't get me wrong, there's just negative stories about Barrett, but it's much more mixed for Barrett than anything else. And I think this is just another one of these, like, they're just shoving us down our throats to help create a little more political bias and yada yada, et cetera, et cetera. Barrett is a complicated Supreme Court nominee. I don't know how she's going to legislate, and I think that's the problem. You can guess how Lagoa and Rushing will legislate, because they're much more likely to legislate constitutionally than anything else. And Barrett's complicated, and I'm not saying she won't legislate constitutionally, because I think there's a whole bunch of different factors. I actually think she's more like Kavanaugh than anything else, and Kavanaugh, I think, and you can argue it's partially because of all the political bullshit that happened to him, but for the most part, he's legislated pretty fairly, I think. I would say he's a much more center-right, kind of ideologically speaking. I don't know how you want to interpret that. And I think he's done a fair job. He's not great, but he's on the right side of the lockdowns, at the very least in terms of his opinions on it. Barrett is complicated, though, because when you do just a cursory Google search, you're not really going to find a lot on Barrett. You're not going to find a lot on her decisions. You're not going to find a lot of her decisions specifically on, and the truth is a lot of her decisions are, they're very pro-business, aggressively so. Sometimes in violation of your constitutional rights, and I'm not saying she's an authoritarian, but out of all the Supreme Court justice nominees, she's probably the closest, I would say, and I don't like that. And don't get me wrong, I think being on the Seventh Circuit versus being on the Supreme Court is going to be a big difference and a big jump, and you're going to be on, and I think they're going to put her through the ringer, so I'm hoping that that'll be enough to wake her up to actually legislate fairly and constitutionally. I'll put it to you this way, I don't have the most positive thoughts, and don't get me wrong, I think a lot of the stuff that the Democrats are putting on her is bullshit about the religion stuff and questioning her in that particular perspective and point of view. But I think she's just like a terrible choice, because I think if anyone's going to be an authoritarian, Supreme Court nominee, it's probably going to be her. And it's really only one case, but the way she went about that particular case was I guess concerning, because she was on the wrong side of the actual lockdown orders and actually put, was people on lockdown, at least in terms of the appeals specifically, she was against it. And the cases that she cited were very alarming, notably the Jacobson case, which, for those of you who don't know, I forgot, I think it might have been 1905, but specifically that case gives the federal government authority, and it hasn't been used in fairness, although technically speaking, legally, due to precedent, it is legal for the federal government to force vaccinations on you. And then she cites that, and then it leads to, the Buck case where specifically that case leads to Korematsu. And the Butt case is basically like they can force you to do what they want if they deem you specifically incapable of doing this, which I think most people would interpret. Well, first off, that case is about sterilization. If you're an incompetent person and you're an insane sexual individual, et cetera, then you're not in the right state of mind, so we can sterilize you because you're gonna procreate, a terrible person. And it's a long, complicated story, and I'm getting that case probably really wrong. But basically, it's forced sterilization that they could legally do, and forced sterilize a lot of people because of that judicial ruling. And technically speaking, a lot of people could broadly interpret that as, hey, we can force you to get vaccinations, et cetera, because you're clearly not in the right mind, and they're gonna, it's a problem with, federal authority. And then the Korematsu case, I personally don't like. Had family in the internment camps in Japan, but the Korematsu versus the United States, which upheld the legal status of the Japanese intern in these camps due to wartime effort and for strategic reality, basically the most bullshit way. In which case, all three of those cases, they could legally just say, you don't have any constitutional rights in this particular pandemic or what we deem a specific pandemic. That's a problem. It's one thing, and she's not the most intellectually sounded-minded person. A lot of her decisions are not very, I don't want to say well thought out, but they're very basic. And if she's using these specific cases as examples for a lot of, as the precedents, she's basically saying, that's a problem. And that when I brought up the Stickman ruling early, which you have to look at, it is deeply fascinating, and that's going to change how a lot of things are going to be done. And I think people are going to start using that Stickman ruling and precedent to get rid of these fucking lockdown orders, because that one is as solid as you can absolutely get. Stickman, I think, versus Pennsylvania or something like that. I don't know. Basically speaking, though, that ruling is as detailed as you can get in comparison to Coney Barrett's ruling. It's not as intellectually sound. So I guess my personal view is I don't like Coney Barrett, but I'm hopefully optimistic for the kind of judicial Supreme Court justice that she can be. She's more like Roberts than anything else. If she's more like Alito, I'm not going to have a problem with it. But unfortunately, she really appears to be much more of a Roberts kind of person, a little bit of an opportunistic individual, and I don't really like that in people. I just, like, if you're a Supreme Court justice, you're supposed to be as, and it really fucking depends, that's why I have so much respect for Gorsuch, and to an extent, I've really looked fondly on Kavanaugh, in respect. And if you're going to be Supreme Court justice, you really just got to be objective and just do your job constitutionally speaking and reading the law as an originalist. And I mean, I hope for the best, I don't know what's going to happen in the next couple months. I know she's going to be absolutely put through the fucking ringer, and it's going to be a whole bunch of media BS. I think outside of, like, say, Mitt Romney or a couple people just surprised dissenting, she's going to get confirmed before the election, probably a week or two before the actual election itself. And she's probably going to be the 9th Supreme Court justice and, legislate and rule. And I will say this before I go, people worried about, they're going to overturn Roe versus Wade, etc., Roe v. Wade, and do a whole bunch of, it's going to be fucking 1950s America again. Stop. You got to stop this, okay? Let's just start with it. Roe v. Wade, a lot of people are saying that she's going to be, the deciding vote that's going to absolutely be sure of it, since there's, 5 specific people that are hardcore. I'm going to be 100% honest with you. I don't even think they have 2 votes right now. Right now. And Coney Barrett's not going to vote for Roe v. Wade. She's just not. I just don't see it happening with her. She's a bit of at the very least, she seems much more of an opportunistic individual. And I think if that case does come up, she's going to probably just dissent or just abstain from the vote. The truth is you have maybe 2 votes. You maybe have Alito, and I think you maybe have God, I can't think of people's names right now. The H.W. Bush. one who got Anita Hill for the most part. God, I can't think of his fucking name. But you got two people for the most part. You don't have Roberts. You don't have really anybody else. At least in my view, you certainly don't have the liberal judges, and I don't know how Gorsuch and Kavanaugh would vote, and I don't think either one of them would vote positively for it at the very least. I think they would. I think they would also abstain from voting too. So people who are saying that everyone's gonna be freaking out because of I just gotta be honest with you. Like, her being on the Supreme Court, she's gonna be status quo stuff. Like, nothing's gonna change. That's just how I see it. And nothing's, it is what it is. It is interesting. I wonder what would have happened if he chose another Supreme Court nominee. But we'll have to see. Hope you guys like and listen, and thank you for listening to me, and have a great day.